I have a story to share about my cousin who came across a pair of skinwalkers. We are Dinye, and we currently live in the res. Well, before I speak on the encounter, let me give some family background which will make a lot more sense. My great-great-grandfather was a medicine man. He returned from the long walk, which the Navajo survived. After he came back, he carried with him a medicine bundle, and from what I was told, it had sand from the 4 sacred mountains, and maybe other sacred things too, even though I never seen it myself. It was supposed to be passed down to someone who deserved it, someone who could use it for the greater good. Now, my great-great-grandfather had 2 wives, which wasn't unusual at the time. The first wife, my great-great-grandmother, was given the task of deciding who would inherit the bundle, but things didn't go as planned. The second wife, out of jealousy, stole it. She knew the bundle had powers, and she didn't care that it was meant for good. She wanted it for herself, for her family. We didn't know it was gone at first. We had no idea they had taken it and were using it, until a medicine man told us what was happening. I can't quite remember, but he said he started having visions and signs that something was wrong. Now keep in mind that not anybody can be a medicine man. It takes years, decades of study and practice. He said he started having dreams about the mountains weeping and the land below cracking open and releasing dark spirits into the world, animals behaving strange, storms happening out of nowhere. And so he decided to perform a ceremony to seek answers. During one of the ceremonies, he was guided by the spirits. It was here that he saw the vision more clear. He saw the second family, the stolen bundle, and the dark ceremonies they were performing. The spirits were showing him how they painted themselves with white and blood and sang the evil songs. The vision was so strong that it left the medicine man shaken. He knew that the bundle had to be returned, smudged and buried, or put up in a tree way into a forest. However, he didn't know who these people were or who they were related to. Keep in mind that in the Navajo Nation, you can track your family ancestors, basically your whole lineage. He didn't know who these people were until after the whole encounter that my cousin had. We knew the second family, just never really hanged out with them. However, my cousin on the other hand, I remember he started hanging out with them. He didn't think much of it. After all, they were family. They would share stories in general and offer him a drink or two. And before long, he found himself going with them more often. My cousin wasn't even grown enough to drink, so maybe that's why he was easily tempted into going to hang out with them. Also, my cousin had been going through a rough patch, just like every teenager does in that age of feeling depressed and just feeling a bit lost. Well, this family seemed to offer a kind of refuge, you can say. They were always ready with a bottle to tell him it was good to relax, to forget about his problems for a while. He didn't notice that at first, but they were slowly pulling him in, getting him comfortable. As the weekends went on, the drinking got heavier, and the conversations took on a darker side. They started talking about things that made him uneasy, gossiping about our family, about my great-great-grandpa, grudges being held, even ceremonies at that. I'm not sure what their ultimate plan was. Maybe it was just to use them as a spy or something else. I'll ask my family when I get a chance though, but I don't think they want to talk about this chapter in our lives anymore. So one night, it went too far. He was drunk, laying on the floor, and he woke up sometime in the early morning. The room was dark except for the dim light from the fire. He didn't let on that he was awake. He just lay there with his eyes barely open, listening. That's when he saw 2 of the ladies. They started doing something strange. He said that he saw them spread coyote skins out in front of them. They started painting themselves with this white paint and what looked to be blood. He said he could feel the air in the room change as well, like something was coming. He then said that they started singing in this low, creepy voice, something about evil. My cousin said that he couldn't hear it all, but he said it made his skin crawl. To this day, he said he's never going to repeat what they were saying or singing, too scared that it might bring a curse on him, which I actually don't blame him. And then, the part he could barely believe, he said as he was watching, they picked up the coyote skins and started wearing them, but they didn't just wear them. It was like the skins became part of them, onto their bodies. He then said that they ran out the door, but that he stayed there frozen, not even moving. When he was sure that they were gone, he grabbed his stuff and ran. He didn't even look back. He went straight home and told his mom everything. My aunt scolded him, told him to stop drinking with them, that it wasn't safe. He did listen and never went back. When my cousin told us this, our side of the family took him to see a medicine man, which is the same medicine man that I told you about in the beginning that found out something was going on, but that he didn't know who this family was, and that's when everything came to light. He took some time, but eventually we were told everything, that they had been using the bundle for dark ceremonies, for evil. The bundle that was meant for healing, for protection, had been twisted and turned into something evil. They had taken something sacred and turned it against what it was meant for. The medicine man did come to our home and he smudged all of us, performing a cleansing ceremony to protect us from any harm that might come our way. The smoke from the sage filled the air as he started singing. He called upon the spirits to watch over us, to shield us from the evil that had messed up the bundle. The ceremony was intense. The air felt heavy with the weight of what happened, but as the smoke drifted away, I did feel a sense of relief, like a burden had been lifted. The medicine man did assure us that the ceremony would prevent that family from being able to harm us. Whatever power they had gained from the bundle, it wouldn't touch us anymore. He also warned us to stay vigilant, to keep our distance from them. We knew better now. We had seen what jealousy and the misuse of sacred things can do, and we weren't about to let it happen again. After that night, my cousin was never the same. He learned a hard lesson, not just about hanging with people he didn't fully know, but also about the dangers of drinking and letting his guard down. He realized too late that sometimes, even those who seem like family can have dark plans, evil intentions. He did stop going over and stop drinking, and started keeping to himself more, and started learning the traditional way with all of us. The fear of what he saw haunted him, but it also made him more cautious about who he trusted. This is the weird part, and I guess this comes with practicing these things, or maybe doing things you aren't supposed to be doing. Ever since all this went down, strange things started happening to the ones who stole the bundle. One of the men in that family died, and another guy in the family got real sick. After everything, we just didn't hear from them again. This wasn't just an experience for my cousin, but for all of us as well, to be cautious of those around us, especially the ones who seem nice at first. Not everyone has good intentions, and some will hide their true nature until it's too late. This is especially true here on the res. There's a reason why we as Navajo are careful about who we share our stories with and our lives with. It's not about just being closed off as you hear. We learned over generations to protect what's sacred, to keep our knowledge within our community, because once it's out there, you can't control how people will use it. You see, my cousin thought that he was just having a drink with family, but he didn't really know them. So always be mindful of who you become friends with, especially if you live in the res. Every old-timer in Alum Creek has their own story of what happened. Hell, even half the young people think they know how it went down. Don't listen to anyone who wasn't there. It's like that game we used to play as young kids where you take a piece of yarn tied to 2 cups and pass it around a circle repeating some sort of message. Telephone, that's what we called it. Only difference is that in the telephone game, the story starts off as something simple and gets more and more crazy as it goes. But this story, it gets more and more credible the younger the teller, almost like it's too much to be believed. So listeners correct for realism when they retell it, so as not to sound crazy. My own grandson told me the other day that I remember it wrong, that it was all just some sort of tragic accident, about a bear. Something ain't right about that. A 12-year-old kid telling his grandfather what he should and shouldn't remember. So don't listen to the young people. They weren't there. The truth is, most of us old folks weren't there either. The way we talk, you would guess every miner in town was caught up in it all. Like how every boomer will tell you he was at Woodstock. It was only maybe 20 of us. Of those, a sight more than half are dead and buried, except for old Rashi Singh. The bastard had himself cremated. I'll start over. Forgive me if I repeat myself. 1956. Like just about every young man, I was working in the mines. Hard work. Plus nothing else paid as good. Nothing I was qualified for at any rate. And I had a wife, a kid, and another one on the way to support. Besides, my friends were also in the mining business. Ralph Hatfield, Rashi, and Sid. We would hit the bars after work, with me leaving early on account of the family, and Rashi would just get some juice. Now Ralph didn't much care for the bartender. Most of us didn't. Jesse tended bar not because he was especially good at it, but because he didn't have the stomach for man's work. He even hired kids to mow his lawn and do landscaping. He wasn't ashamed of it. He thought it made him smarter than the rest of us. I don't know if I ever caught Jesse in town without some full sideways grin. Ralph suspected that Jesse got his job by sleeping with the widow bar owner. I don't think so, but it wasn't impossible. Jesse had nearly half a dozen exes, or current lovers. He was smooth with women and had a pretty face, high cheekbones, sharp nose. That was enough reason for most of us to dislike him. Ralph had more claim to hate Jesse than most. Those who aren't from West Virginia probably know all about the Hatfields and McCoys, but that's nothing compared to the families of Ralph and Jesse. You see, during the Cold Wars, Ralph's family fought for the Unions, and Jesse's family owned the mines. But if you gave Jesse a hard time about it, he would always come back with something to say. Jesse was always a funny guy. That, combined with the fact that he never got angry, kept the rest of us from truly hating him, except for, of course, Ralph. June 10th was when it all started. Cicada season. They were bad that year too. So many damn insects you could hydroplane on their guts if your tire threads were bare. The mine was a safe place from them. You wouldn't have to listen to the never-ending screech. But on this season, the mine was even worse than the outside. It echoed. It's not even pretty sounding like a cricket, at least not to me. So it's no wonder we ended up working deeper than we normally would. We got far enough that we couldn't hear a peep and went to work. A couple of hours into the day. Anytime there was a crack, the rest of us were nervous to slide through. But Rashi was a skinny guy and could damn near fit through the bars on a baby's crib. Rashi would have it covered. We waited around for no more than 10 minutes before Rashi squeezed back towards us. I had never seen the man so excited. "Stop everyone right now," he said with an accent. "It's a treasure room. In most mines, the demolition experts calculate the proper amount of black powder, and then everyone draws straws on who has to light the fuse. But most mines didn't employ Sid, the craziest son of a bitch I ever knew. Sid did all the blasting himself. He loved to be as close to the explosion as he was allowed to. Most of us figured that he was going to end up going the way of his grandfather and die in such a blast. But he blew the neck wide open without event, and we all had to look for ourselves. What we saw was a gold mine. Well, no, it wasn't. It was a coal mine, but there was a lot of coal that was easy to collect. The owner was too excited. He hired everyone in town not already working for him, at least twice the normal rate. Even Jesse couldn't resist a few weeks of hard labor for that kind of money. We ended up working like dogs all week, taking as many hours at double pay as possible. Predictably, Jesse was the laziest of all, but we needed him to have enough energy to pour our drinks after work, so no one said a thing. Now, I'm not sure who saw it. I want to say it was Jesse who came strutting back with a proud smile to tell us all of his find. Jesse, or whoever it was, found yet another neck, one that was wide enough that anyone could walk through. The new room was small, but filled with coal. Loose coal too. That should have been the first sign. Coal doesn't just sit on the surface, stacked knee deep, ready to be scooped up into bags. But we were greedy, and now we had 2 rooms to work. A handful of guys I barely knew ended up working the smaller room. We called it the pirate's chest. I'll admit we were greedy. We robbed pillars and were too aggressive with the cutting machine. But that room, it shouldn't have collapsed the way it did. I've been in natural collapses before. This was not one of them. Some of the miners will tell you that everything was quiet and normal, like right up until the cave-in. But no, there was one sound. A sound that still haunts me even now. The most rational explanation is that the men in the pirate's chest shouted before the rocks gave way. But I know what I heard. It was a scream, but not a human one. It wasn't a shout of anger or fear. If you ask me how I figure a demon might yawn, I would tell you I don't have to guess. That sound, that was us waking something up. Something buried underneath all that coal. That 3 or so men working the treasure room got sucked under that big pile of black. That's when the cave-in started. It was the big chamber that went first. The one that me and my buddies were working. The hallway Sid had blasted out fell in on itself without so much as a groan to warn us. Most were able to run through the corridor in time and make it out. A couple were buried in the rubble, crushed flat as pancakes. Hooper Collins had his leg pinned underneath a boulder, which would be the depth of him, 19 or 20, I think. The guy had a pretty wife and no kids by her yet. Anyways, I noticed poor Hooper hollering and screaming. I did the best that I could to roll the rock off his leg. I wasn't even finished before Ralph screamed and pointed. A couple of the new recruits had rushed into that small room to avoid the boulders. Foolish mistake. Then, the screams I heard next were definitely human. I didn't watch. I didn't see. But you can't mistake the sound of flesh being yanked apart. So I gave up on Hooper and ran for the rest of the survivors. I still try to forget how he begged me not to run, the words that he used. I failed at that. I ran. Not far, just around a corner, and soon every healthy body was huddled around the cave-in. Desperately trying to dig out. It was pointless, but I jumped in anyway. What else could I do? When the screaming stopped, that's when the eating began. It must have gone on for half an hour, tearing, cracking. We all knew what the entree was, and each of us were digging faster. Eventually, of course, the panic wore off and we had time to think. What was back there? But most important, what would it do when it's done with its meal? And we all knew that we hadn't made progress escaping. West Virginians are just stubborn, I guess. As horrifying as the sounds were, the silence was far worse. The dinner was done. Hopefully, it was filling. Everyone stopped. We need to figure this out, screamed Sid. He held up his light and we all faced him. Over a dozen of us were huddled, some crying, but all of us were shaking as if naked in a blizzard. We took a break from the digging and shut up for a moment. Everyone except for Rodney, the preacher's son, who fell to his knees and wouldn't stop praying no matter what the rest of us did. Rodney wasn't half as holy as his father, but at least one of us asking heaven for help couldn't have hurt. Finally, someone spoke. It was Ralph. He always had a clear head, even did a couple of years of college. He kept his voice lower than Sid had. It's gonna take days to dig ourselves out. That thing will get us if dehydration doesn't. And it's guarding the TNT if that becomes our only option. We can post a watch, guards to make sure it doesn't come in here. It was Jesse who said it, trying to maintain his composure. Are you volunteering? You'll rather stand around and dig like the rest of us, said Ralph. Most of the water and lights are in the room with it, said Sid. We got it outnumbered. Can it die? Of course, said Ralph. I read a whole issue on undiscovered things in the National Geographic. Most life in the ocean is unknown, and there's all sorts of cave creatures that we never knew about. This thing is an animal, and animals can die. What does it eat? I asked. No one responded for a minute. Then Ralph nodded. The coal's energy too, made of carbon, just like living things. There's animals and critters out there that digest minerals. Now, I can't speak to the accuracy of this claim, or even my memory, but I wanted to think that Ralph was right. It was an animal. I'm not sure I believed it, but I wanted to. Around that time, Rodney stopped praying and shouted at us. It's no animal. It's no natural thing at all. It's a demon, drawn to our greed and wickedness. Rodney, please, said Jesse in a whisper. I think it was Sid that hit him in the back of the head. Not hard enough to knock him unconscious, but with plenty of force to knock him over and shut him up. Right away, Rashi went to go tend to Rod, giving Sid a sharp glare. No one else seemed to care. I don't know of many animals that can survive being hit with 7, 8 pickaxes, said someone whose name and face I can't recall. 9 by my count. It was Ralph. He didn't have to tell us the math, that there wasn't enough access for everyone. Rodney could barely walk, and Paul had a broken arm, which left me and 2 others to fight with rocks. Rashi was a little luckier. He kept this special blade on him everywhere he went. It was a long dagger with all sorts of ornaments. In the 50s, in Appalachia, a knife wouldn't bother anybody. Shoot, back then it wasn't uncommon for a guy to walk through town with a 6-shooter on his belt. None of us had a gun, of course, but I would have traded my rock for a good knife any day. The biggest threat here is gonna be friendly fire. Who was the fellow who said that? Can't get his name. I remember his stories, and he had been a sergeant in Korea. Damn. Fuck. Age is a hell of a thing. Anyways, the veteran advised us a bit. Watch where you swing, but don't stop hitting it until it stops moving. We drew up a battle plan with the sergeant's help, who would approach from what angle. The longer we waited, the more we feared we would lose our nerve. The creature hadn't made a sound for so long, only added to our worries. Was it planning something? Was it even smart enough to plan, as a unit? We rounded the bend and shined our lights the best we could. Half the standing lights were out, and out of all the remaining ones, most were knocked over. Little strips of white shined in random directions, like some sort of pattern, but unless it was hiding in the shadows, it was no creature. Blood and gut trails told a story, that the thing had drugged the dead into the pirate's chest to feast. Hooper's leg was still pinned underneath the boulder, but there was no sign of the rest of him. No one wanted to be first in line, so we crept towards what had to be this animal's real lair, weapons raised. About halfway there, something dropped onto us, or rather, onto Sarge. We hadn't even thought about an attack from above, so the whole plan was shot. Half of us ran, half attacked. I did a little bit of both. Before I go further, I'm gonna try my best to describe the creature. Just keep in mind, this was about 30 or 35 years ago. It moved faster than a rabbit, and I only ever got a real good look at it one time, at least with my own eyes. I can't count how many times I've seen it in dreams, but I suppose I saw it well enough for any man. But how tall I can't even guess, 'cause it was bent over with the twistiest damn pretzel of a spine I ever saw. At least 4 legs and as many arms, and at the end of each limb, a dozen fingers. Or maybe they were antennas, legs on a shrimp. Shit, I don't even know. I know it didn't have eyes. I do remember that. It only had one thing on its head, the mouth. A cross between the tail of an earwig and a crocodile's maw. But boy, was it skinny. Too skinny for how strong it was. And the flesh didn't look so tough. Translucent, almost worm-like. It had armor, like that of an insect, but the plates intersected more like the shell of a crawfish. Any more descriptions would be stretching the truth on my part. Whatever it was, an insect or a demon, it tore the sergeant apart in seconds. I couldn't bring myself to charge in close, so I threw my rock at its head. May as well have thrown a beach ball. Even the axe swings of these men were making cracks in it. I grabbed the pick that Sarge had dropped, or had his hand been ripped apart. Either way, I almost stepped on it when this thing ended up grabbing Ralph. I would like to think that I would have helped out if Rashi hadn't acted first. Rashi stuck that holy dagger of his into this monster easy as cutting cake. Your guess is as good as mine as why it worked. Maybe the dagger was better quality than the picks. Maybe something else. But the thing recoiled without making a sound and Ralph was free. Lucky stab or not, 2 more bodies were laying at this creature's feet, and there was nothing to do but run again. At least that's what everyone thought who wasn't Sid. In the midst of everything, he was able to find and light a stick of dynamite. "Keep your distance, boys," he shouted, running back to the fight. Don't get any romantic notion that Sid was a martyr. I knew the man as well as anybody, and he had no intention of dying. Just like he had no plan to slip on a pile of guts, twist his ankle too bad to stand, lose his grip on the explosive, and fail to catch the monster in the blast. All but 1 or 2 of us cleared the explosion, not counting Sid, who went out like everybody had guessed but in circumstances an oracle couldn't have predicted. At least we were alive. Our eyes and ears were none too happy, but the monster seemed worse off, skittering about in random directions, tripping over itself. A sound-driven creature, blinded by the noise. Maybe. We had to leave. Ralph spotted our way out, a chimney blown open by the blast. We would have to brave the middle of the room, praying the monster would avoid us with its random shuffles, and it would take 2 men to reach the opening, one on the shoulders of the other. What choice did we have? We went for it. I recall Jesse weeping as he climbed onto my back, and for a moment, I judged them for it, until I realized that I was crying too. To his credit, Jesse felt a ledge once through the opening, and did his best to pull the rest of us up. Halfway through, Jesse and Rashi and a couple others having reached safety, this creature grabbed somebody. Matthew Stewart, I believe. No one watched them die, and no one tried to help him. I confess feeling a bit of relief, thinking the catch will distract it long enough for us to climb. A sinful thought, sure, but I committed much worse. 8 or 9 of us were left, and of all of those, only 2 of us had lights. We shined them upwards, and would you believe that we couldn't even see the roof? I don't know the chances of that. A passage appearing right above us, straight shot to the surface. Praise Jesus, we've been delivered, said Rodney. No one could really argue the point. We climbed, I'm not sure for how long. It was tiring work, but adrenaline's a powerful thing. At first, we braced our backs to one wall and used our legs along the opposite. Then it turned into more like a steep slope that we had to scale with our hands. A few outcroppings gave us chances to rest. Sometimes, the mouth would widen, and we could offer support to the weaker man. Others, it would narrow, and we would have to squeeze through one at a time. And in one of those cases, we lost another man. A wide frame can be a blessing or a curse in a mine, and Leon was just too stout to fit. Even with someone pushing from under and pulling from above, it didn't take long until Leon was wedged so tight, he couldn't even go back down. He would have needed to break his shoulders to move. Ralph offered to do just that, yank his arms out of their sockets, that is. And keep on climbing how? Liam asked. Then, still stuck, the man pulled out a pocket knife and cut his own throat. Rodney screamed, and all I could think was how fortunate I was to be above him rather than below. It did take breaking his arms to dislodge his corpse. He actually didn't mind. Just fell 10 feet before sticking someplace else. There'll be time to pray for his soul later. We kept on for as long as we could, which wasn't long. No, a few minutes later, and we came across the worst thing any of us had ever seen, not counting this creature. The ceiling. One of the lights went out. It can't be, Rodney whispered. We're trapped. The chances of coming out to the surface were always slim, said Ralph, with no emotion in his voice. I just wish we had a few cigarettes to share. What time is it? Most likely dark by now, said Ralph. Then they're gonna send somebody. Where Jesse's confidence came from, I can't say, but I did envy it. Maybe there's already a rescue party digging through the rubble. We'll be home by morning. Is that what you want, Jesse? It was Ralph. All of our friends and fathers getting themselves killed. No, of course not. I just mean, shut up, said Ralph. And he did. No one said much of anything for the next hour. A few sobs, even a couple grim chuckles. I assumed that most of us accepted what was going to happen. A small part of me held out hope for rescue. There was no way to warn the rescuers. even if anyone was coming. Nothing to do at all but wait and make peace with our Creator. Then, the last light went out. I doubt you'll ever experience a darkness like that. Sure, maybe you experienced pitch black. Maybe you've been underground. But I'm talking about the kind of dark that fills your insides, where even a pair of eyes 3 inches from yours don't glow. The kind dark so deep you know you won't ever see light again. The little room we had sat ourselves in somehow started feeling a lot smaller all of a sudden, and the rock scraping my back became harder to ignore. There's no one on this earth that would wish this sort of death upon them. Being buried alive, I would have traded anything just to stretch my arms out. In a way, it was almost like drowning. I nearly drowned once, when I was 12. I was trying to impress this girl by swimming across a lake. It was fun, at first, until it hit me like a baseball bat how much water was between my feet and the lake's floor. I remember clearly how oppressive all that water felt as my head was starting to sink under it. An older girl had saved me. Dying underground was similar, all the stone above and below me for who knows how far. But no 11th grader was coming this time. Of all the things to reach out in mercy, it was the moon, a little stream of blue light above our heads. It took our eyes a bit to adjust and even make the light out. I thought I was hallucinating, until Jessie shrieked in joy. The chimney did go all the way to the surface, but only a tiny slit, not near enough to scurry up. "I can do it," Rashi said. "The hell you can," snapped Ralph. Rashi placed a hand on his cheek. "I can do it. Have faith." Rashi took off his boots and his jacket, spit on his palms and steeled himself. "Rashi," I said, "I also have faith." "I'll be back," he said. "And with a whole bunch of people. And guns," said Ralph. Rashi smiled. "And guns." Before he left, he stopped for a second. I thought he was second-guessing himself. Then he handed me his knife. "I thought your religion said you always had to carry this." Rashi just laughed. We couldn't see him climb. He blocked out the light, but we listened for minutes as he wiggled through the impossible small opening. At some point, his grunt stopped, and I had fear he suffocated himself. But then he shouted down to us, "I made it. I'll be back soon." There still wasn't much conversation as we waited, but at least it no longer felt like drowning. "Thank you, Father. Thank you. I'm done with drinking. I'm done with gambling. I'll never stray from my wife again," Rodney was praying. "Speak for yourself," said a guy I can't remember. "First thing I'm doing when we get out of this is having a cold beer. Fuck it, make that 3. A few of us laughed, a lot louder than the joke was funny. But that's when I heard it. "Shh," I said, and everyone clammed up quick. The air wasn't quiet. We could all hear it. It was Liam's flesh. It was tearing, and then being swallowed. "Fuck," said Rodney. "We've been delivered. Why is it back?" "Rashi's coming with guns," said Jesse. "He'll make it back fast. It took that thing a while to eat the poor fellas last time. We have time." "It had more than one body to eat last time," said Ralph. "What if it finishes before Rashi returns?" I'm not sure if I thought of it on my own, or if it's what Ralph was trying to imply, but a way to buy us a few precious minutes crossed my mind. I didn't voice the plan though. It was just too damn messed up. Rodney voiced it for me. "An offering," he said. "That thing down there, it's a devil, a demonic spirit." We don't know that," said Ralph. Rodney continued. "It's a demon if there ever was one. Demons are drawn to the wickedness. Someone brought it here, and only an offering will satisfy it. An evil offering for an evil thing." "Rod, what are you trying to say?" asked Jesse. No one answered for a moment, but the silence was broken by a bone that was cracking. Marrow being sucked. This creature was wrapping up his meal. "Maybe you're right, Rod," said Ralph. "Maybe this devil has wanted a sacrifice all along." "Come on, Ralph. You don't believe in that sort of superstition," said Jesse. "I'm not sure what I believe anymore, Jesse, but I know that thing is hungry, and I got a pretty strong notion who the most wicked man among us is. He comes from a long line of wicked folks." The next minute or two is a blur, most likely because I try to block it out, but like mostly everything I tried in my life, I didn't do it well enough. Please understand. I don't remember laying a finger on Jesse. Cross my heart and swear on my children. The way I remember it, I stood back and was just looking. Even tried to reason with Ralph and the others to leave Jesse be. I gone over it 1,000 times in my head, maybe 100,000, and I still don't remember myself killing somebody. But maybe the mind is more powerful than the soul, able to change memories that are too horrible to recall. Because one thing I do remember are my knuckles being stained in blood, half mine and half his. I remember looking at that, flat as a washboard face, the punches of 12 men having removed any evidence of Jesse's high cheekbones and pointy nose. I remember how he looked white as marble in the moonlight. I remember his screams and demanding why, and I remember when those words were replaced by pitiful gargles, much worse than the creature itself. It's that memory which still haunts me. I can forget about it most days, but I remember it every night. Whiskey does help, a little, and that's how you know if the old timer telling you the story was actually there. That's how you can be sure. Before we tossed the body down the hole, we nodded to each other in a silent pact, not to tell anybody about what happened. We weren't even supposed to talk about it with each other. That was the unspoken vow. So if somebody knows about Jesse, they were there. No mistake. I have often wondered if I could have stopped it. I knew it was wrong, and I remember protesting some. I had the dagger, and I knew it didn't care for loud sounds. Could be if I was braver, I could have used the knife and the knowledge to fight the monster off. But if I stood in the way of this mob, they most likely would have killed us both. However you cut it, I was a coward. I'm a coward. Why did Rashi have to leave for help? He wouldn't have let it happen. Rashi was a good man. He made good on his word too. But the guns proved unnecessary. The rescue party never came across the creature, coming straight back to the crag and digging us out. I'm guessing this creature left when it felt so many people around. But the creature was no longer in the mine when the townsfolk went back to recover what little was left of the bodies. Most of the survivors skipped town, moving with barely a goodbye to the friends and relatives they grew up with. One came back, eventually, but the rest I never saw again. With the biggest mine shut down, there was less work. The owner of the mines talked about reopening a time or two. Most of the workers were willing to go on strike if he did. I had switched to another trade by then. I spent the next 20 years in lumber, but that mine is still buried. The way I hear it, kids go up there sometimes to see who's brave enough to hike in and touch the big cursed rock pile. Parents say it's dangerous because it can cave in. Grandparents say it's dangerous too, but for different reasons. It's still out there, somewhere. Maybe it found another cave to call home. Or maybe it's never much like being underground and lives in some forest, in the woods now. Before we came along, I'm guessing it was trapped, and maybe we let it loose into the world. I guess I'll never know. Not sure that I want to. I'll be dead soon, in a box. Maybe Rashi had the right of it. Buried things have a tendency not to stay buried, if it wouldn't cause an uproar at the church. Funny, why should I even care? Stepping inside a building less than 100 times, and those were just for weddings, funerals, and Easter Sundays. There would be a scandal all the same. I never did make trouble alive. I figured no use in starting after I die. Telling you the story, the whole story, is some sort of penance. People should know what's out there in the dark, as much as they should know what we did. On Judgment Day, when I have to look Jesse in the eye and give account for how I lived, the things I done, at least I can say I told it like it happened, not until the end. So if the good judge sees that it's fitting to condemn me, well, I guess I can't protest all too much. Maybe, in whatever hell I'm heading for, I'll meet the creature again. A lot of thinking and a couple of drinks later, I'm finally gonna share some of my experiences. The area where I worked was incredibly isolated, surrounded by dense forest and rugged wilderness. I was a ranger up there. It was in the late 1990s. The rules and regulations can feel distant. You'll see what I mean by this later on. We drive around on an ATV, making sure the wildlife was safe and occasionally dealing with poachers. My job mainly involved ensuring the safety of the deer population and handling other wildlife management jobs. My only colleague was a guy that I'm gonna call Peter. Short and easy to remember. Peter was your typical backwoods guy, a bit of a wild man who brewed his own moonshine and smoked like a chimney. He had been my best friend for several years and always had my back, no matter what we faced out there in the woods. The pay for the job wasn't great, but it came with perks that made it worth it. We had no boss breathing down our necks and we could basically go camping, get wasted, and call it a getaway. In the midst of everything, we were still able to arrest some people and put some real poachers behind bars. However, sometimes we got calls that made us actually do some work, hard work at that. If people spotted sick animals, it was up to us to go out there and make sure they didn't spread disease. If an animal showed aggressive behavior that might endanger locals, we had to make sure it was put down. We had friends at a local vet who would run blood samples if we suspected rabies or something similar. One day, Peter and I got a call from some pretty spooked locals. They told us that some boys had gone hunting a couple of days ago, but none of them had returned. They all believed the boys had been killed by bears or a wolf. Great, now we had to venture out in the wilderness to deal with potentially aggressive carnivores. The locals pointed us in the general direction, and we took off on our ATVs. We drove around the area for about 3 hours when we found an abandoned campsite. It was evident that the camp had been trashed by something, most likely a bear by the looks of it. The boys had left camp in a hurry, not even taking their rifles with them. From there, we went out on foot with our guns drawn, just in case. We found the first body a few meters away from the camp. He was lying on his stomach with several deep wounds in his back. What struck us as weird was that there were deep puncture wounds, which we had never seen before in a bear or a wolf attack. There was also a clear path, indicating where the other boys had fled. We found 2 more boys in the same small area, both lying dead with similar marks. One of them had been gutted. Peter was visibly shaken by the scene and just kept shaking his head in disbelief. According to the locals, there were supposed to be 4 boys out there, so we were still missing 1. We both nearly jumped out of our skins when we heard something rustling through the brush towards us. We aimed at the commotion and waited for it to reveal itself before we shot. I almost dropped my rifle when it came from the dense bushes. It was a red stag, with the mangled remains of the boy stuck in its antlers. The stag was struggling to keep its balance under the weight of the boy, but it was still aggressive towards us, as if it was about to charge at us. Peter was the first to snap out of the shock and started lighting the thing up. After further inspection, we noticed that its antlers were worn down and broken. It had put an excessive amount of force behind each of its charges, breaking its antlers on the poor boys. The reason the last boy was stuck in its antlers was because the damn thing had practically torn through his rib cage. We couldn't separate the boy from the antlers, so we had to bring the head of the deer with us. It was one of the most screwed up rides home, with several bodies tied to the back of our ATVs. Pretty disturbing, something I never thought I would be doing. The local police were pretty angry at us, seeing that we had moved bodies from a potential crime scene, but they let us off easy, since the killer was literally embedded in one of the victims. Seeing the heartbroken parents of those boys still haunts me to this day. That night, Peter and I hung out, mostly because I was still really spooked. Man, that stuff wasn't natural, he said at one point. Deer can be aggressive and defend themselves, but I know this one was hunting those boys, and it killed them all as well. They don't fucking do that. And that time was the first time I caught a glimpse of the spooky stuff that goes on out there. In the following years, I saw some deeply insane stuff that only Peter and I know about. I'm going to share some of these stories with you, and hopefully you will believe me and understand why I'm scared every time that I see a deer. About once or twice a month, we had to go on excursions into the wilderness to look for signs of poachers, sick animals, and other stuff like that. One time, we decided to drive out to a fairly secluded area because there were rumors of some potential poaching. It was a very long drive, so we always kind of put it off until the last minute, praying that the poachers would just get mauled by bears so we wouldn't have to make the long journey up there. Some of these places would take about 2, 3, or 4 hours to get there, and this time it took about 2 hours before the terrain became too difficult for even the ATVs to handle. We had to walk the rest of the way, which meant that we had to camp out overnight. Those are the free camping experiences that I told you about. Camping out was a norm for us, but we were further away from anything than I had ever been before, and the previous incident was still haunting my mind. Peter offered me some liquor to ease my worries, but there was no way that I wanted to be drinking, especially if we got attacked by some demonic deer again. The night went by without incident, but I still didn't get enough sleep. We continued our trek towards the supposed poacher hotspot. We arrived and looked around, but we found nothing. There didn't even seem to be any sign of human activity anywhere in the area. Fucking rumors, Peter said to himself as he shook his head in frustration. Normally, we would be happy to find nothing, but this time we were just exhausted and cranky. We were then startled by a loud echo through the forest. What the fuck was that? Peter pulled out his rifle and aimed where the noise was coming from. Even though it went against our instincts, we had to go investigate it. We got to a small ridge that overlooked the clearing. In the middle of the clearing, a group of 5 stags were huddled together, their heads down, as if they were grazing. We noticed that they all seemed to make sudden violent jerking motions, like they were trying to gore the ground with their antlers. Peter fired a shot into the air to make them scatter, and they didn't move. If you have any basic knowledge of wildlife, you will know that any sudden loud noise will make just about any animal take off running. We fired a couple more shots into the air, but they just didn't react. Without thinking, we decided to calmly approach them to get a better look at what they were doing. As we got close, we were met with this nasty stench of rot. Is that a bear? Peter gestured to the ground in front of the stags. To our surprise, there was a large adult black bear. Its body was starting to decompose, which means that it was dead for about 4 or 5 days. The stags were making all sorts of noises and groaning as they continuously gored the carcass over and over again. They looked exhausted and malnourished. The bear's body was completely ripped apart except for its head, which they, for some reason, had left completely alone. We stood frozen to the ground as we watched this horrible scene unfold. How were they able to take down a bear? How is that even possible? I asked Peter. He just shook his head in disbelief as he raised his rifle and shot one of the stags. He later explained that he wanted a blood sample. As soon as the stag fell to the ground, all the others stopped what they were doing, and they just turned to look at us. They were covered in rotting blood and chunks of meat. They didn't show any aggressive behavior. They just stared at us, not flinching nor blinking. Peter changed his mind about the blood sample at this point and just slowly started backing away. I followed him and raised my rifle, just in case. We reached the ridge. They resumed their eating once again, not even paying attention to us. We were so done at this point that we didn't even set up camp that night. We just kept hiking at a brisk pace until we got to our ATVs. None of us said a word during the entire ride home, except for the occasional F word. That incident really did something to Peter. It did take him a couple of weeks before he went with me into the forest again. He was completely convinced that the stags were being manipulated by a witch or something, which I'm not really sure of. I don't really believe in witches and all that. I just believe that nature is a lot more screwed up than we realize. We've been away from untamed nature for so long, living in our towns and cities, that we forget how scary and unpredictable nature can be, especially when it comes to all sorts of animals living in the deep woods. But still, there was something just off about those stags, and I still don't have an explanation. One day, we got a call from the local police. An old man who lived by himself in a remote cabin hadn't been seen in a while. They wanted us to take them to the cabin since they weren't used to the terrain. Being more accustomed to paved streets than the rough wilderness, we drove them out to the cabin and parked a few meters from the front door. It was pretty clear that something happened. The door was completely knocked off its hinges, and the cabin was empty. The officers then asked us to assist them in their search, and we agreed. The initial theory was that he had been taken by a bear, which seemed plausible considering the door's condition. We spread out and followed whatever trails we could find. It only took about half an hour before one of the officers called something in. He sounded a little shaken, but he gave us detailed directions to where he was. He didn't tell us what he had found. He just said, "You'll want to see this for yourselves." When we got to where he was, it wasn't clear what he had found since nothing looked out of place. No broken branches, no trail, nothing. He just pointed up to a long tree in front of him. Slung over one of the higher branches was a fresh deer carcass. Now this was weird, strange, but we didn't see what this had to do with the case. Then we noticed something even stranger further up the tree. There was a black bear carcass. Something had killed a bear and then placed it in the tree. I knew that leopards and other big cats did this later for consumption, but there were no big cats where this took place. The officers looked pretty uneasy, taking nervous glances over their shoulders. We stayed as a group after that. Obviously, we still searched for another couple of hours before we called it. On our way back, we once again passed the tree, and I kid you not, the deer was gone, leaving only some bloody branches behind. We picked up the pace and made our way back out of there without looking back, and, well, we never did find the body. There was a winter where we had a pretty horrible incident. The winters up here can be brutal, especially with heavy snow and temperatures dropping to the negatives. If someone goes missing, they're immediately presumed dead, because it's impossible to maintain your core temperature for long without proper gear. And when it's someone's kid who goes missing, it's even more heartbreaking. The police once again requested our assistance because a mother had reported her 6-year-old daughter missing. The thought of spending hours in the cold wasn't appealing, but we couldn't possibly turn a blind eye to a missing child. The mother had let her children play outside when one of them suddenly ran towards the tree line. They had been out there for some time, calling her name, but they just couldn't find her. That's when they called the police, which they ended up calling us. By the time we arrived at the area, she had been missing for about 2 hours. We followed a trail that we suspected were her tracks, which actually went far longer than what a kid should be able to run, at least at that age. But the strange thing is that the trail just stopped. There was no sidestepping, no scuffling, no signs of anything. It was like she just disappeared on the spot. We examined the tracks to see if she had backtracked or something, but there were no clear signs of any double prints. Peter was visibly upset and frustrated. We then asked the other kids why she started running into the forest, but they had no clear answer. They claimed that she just started running without any warning. The kids were shaking and crying, so we ended up asking the mother to return to their home while we kept looking. An officer followed them back to their house to make sure they felt safe. About 15 minutes later, one of the officers got a call on the radio. We could hear the sound of the mother crying in the background. They had found the girl. She was just sitting on the step of their back door. She was dead and frozen solid. She was only wearing a regular jacket and jeans. Considering that she was supposed to play outside for some time, the mother had locked the doors before they left because she didn't want anybody going inside, possibly to rob anything while they were away. To this day, I still tear up when I think about it, but I still have many unanswered questions about what happened. The obvious answer is that she went back home and then froze to death while she couldn't get inside. But I still think there's more to it. If she had ran back, how is it that none of her siblings or her mom noticed her? Why didn't she respond to their calls? How did she run back without leaving any tracks? How was she almost frozen solid even though she was only missing for 2 hours? Sorry, 4 hours. None of the neighbors saw anything strange, so there was nothing to investigate. The mom, unfortunately, blamed herself and became an alcoholic. I still think about the incident every day, and for some reason, it just hit harder than the 4 boys who had been mauled to death. After what happened to me all those years ago, the one place in the whole world that still rattles my body and sends chills up my spine happens to be my grandmother's farm. When my parents and I would go visit my grandma's one-story farm every 3 years, I was put in the same room. The room and all its velvet blankets and puffy pillows had a cozy vibe to it, along with the rest of the house. But at nighttime, the large window in front of the bed painted a picture of the unsettling wilderness outside, which wouldn't help with my imagination. And ever since I was 6, my brain terrified me with that imagination, using vivid nightmares, sleep paralysis, and everything else in between. So naturally, my fear of the window was always there. You see, most kids have monsters underneath their beds or in their closets. But at my grandma's house, there was something that lurked outside that window. The first time I ever saw it was at 2 in the morning. The creature, which I assumed was just in my head and I was imagining, was at the edge of the woods staring at the window. It was a goat, standing on 2 legs. Its body had the shape of a human, and its claws dangling around its thighs. I slammed my eyes shut and covered myself with my soft blanket, waiting for the thing to evaporate from my imagination. As you can guess, I was tired by the time I woke up. That morning, when my parents were at the town's Walmart, and I was trying to forget last night's experience, I had a pleasant conversation with Grandma. We loved to talk, and we had a special type of chemistry that transcended our generational differences. Curious about her farm, I wanted to know about all her animals. Well, we have all sorts of animals, she said with a grin. I have chickens, peacocks, sheep, hogs, ducks, horses, ponies. I have just about any animal on this farm, besides any kind of goat. You said any goat? I said, recalling the form outside of my window. Why don't you like any goats? Can't you milk them and make cheese? Grandma's face darkened, and she stroked her fingers through her gray hair as her eyes stared into space. Well, according to some people, after God created sheep, the devil, in an effort to desecrate God's sheep, created different kinds of goats. Angry after the devil disgraced his sheep, created a wolf to eat the goats. In a massive tantrum of rage, the devil bit the tails of the goats, marking them as an unholy animal. Then, with a quizzical and hard to decipher face, she said, I thought you would have seen it by now. Haven't you? I knew what she was talking about right away, and it seemed I would burst into a fit of scared shrieking and crying at the thought of my grandmother confirming the thing outside my window was actually real. I tried to rationalize the situation, thinking the goat-like creature was just a dream, and that what my grandma said was unrelated. But at the sight of my distress, my grandmother destroyed that idea with the opening of her mouth. It won't hurt you if you stay inside at night, so there's nothing to worry about. It was supposed to be a comforting statement, but her actually confirming this made it worse. Grandma pretended to forget the conversation, never speaking of it for the rest of the trip. When the night came, I decided to sleep in my parents' bedroom, where the bed faced away from the window, but I swear I heard a glassy tapping from behind me. Lucky for us, my parents and I left the farm the next day, leaving behind the forest and fields of Maryland. But 3 years after this initial incident, after blocking the creature from my memory, I saw it a second time at 11 o'clock at night. I was half asleep on Grandma's couch to the sound of the TV when a reporter shouting, "Breaking news." My eyes initially darting around the room and my brain adjusting to consciousness. I was in shock as I saw the creature, hunched over, in front of the living room window. The half-goat sprang from the window and ran into the distance on its 2 legs. I slapped myself. Snap out of it, but nothing could stop the memories of the creature and what Grandma had said about it. I paced around the room with adrenaline flooding my body, wanting to flee, but not knowing where to go. With a few sleeping pills, however, I willed myself to sleep, with the living room curtains drawn. The morning after, I found a note on the kitchen table. My parents were shopping, and Grandma was at a doctor's appointment. I was alone in the house, and me wanting to find out what was going on, I plugged in my grandmother's outdated Macintosh for a bit of research. Half goat, half man, I typed, which brought up a Wikipedia page on different kinds of cryptids. Not exactly what I was looking for. Goat creature in Maryland, I corrected. And as soon as I hit search, Google presented me with another Wikipedia page. This one on a creature known as the Goatman of Maryland. This was exactly what I was looking for. The Goatman of Maryland is a legendary half-goat, half-human creature that has the head and the hind of a goat and the body of a human. The rest of the page went on to explain how the locals suspect the Goatman is either a failed gene-mixing science experiment or a demonic spawn of the devil, as Grandma had said. For the rest of the week, I saw it every single night. Whenever I was trying to fall asleep in my room, it would be staggering around the clearing outside my window. If I was watching TV late at night, the Goatman would be gazing at the screen from the living room window. And on the last day, when I was feeding Grandma's peacocks in the evening, she came to bring me inside after she saw it approaching the farm. By the end of the second visit, seeing the Goatman was something normal. And with the occasional reminder from Grandma, I respected it and its personal space. 3 years later, however, my third visit to Grandma's ranch showed me what happened when you didn't honor the Goatman's boundaries. On the local news, there was one headline stirring up the rustic community: 10 professional boar hunters killed in animal attack. My parents thought it was horrible, but Grandma and I shot each other looks of shared knowledge. The next morning, the paper arrived at the farm, where the hunting tragedy made the front page. The night before, police found 10 hunters mutilated to death by a wild animal. The hunters' AR-15 magazines were completely full upon dying, and local authorities are stumped as to how none of them could have gotten a single shot off. My parents, who had no knowledge of the Goatman, had no idea what caused the attack, and were as ignorant as the rest of the investigators. So I had to ask Grandma why my parents hadn't seen it yet. Well, she said, the creature only appears to those he finds interesting. You have to understand it can change its views on people. I have these scars from when I was a little girl, but after it got used to me, it stopped. My parents, who were your great-grandparents, were demoted to the low end of the thing's opinions. Their passing and my survival go-to show how unpredictable it can be. I was shaking, even more freaked out by that. The thing had attacked Grandma when she was young, and it seemed like the goat man could change its opinion of me in the blink of an eye. It almost seemed like I had developed something with the creature during my last visit by seeing it all the time and watching TV with it. And not once did I ever go outside at night when it was in charge of the farm. I respected it. Could it really forget all that? Or was I reading into Grandma's statements more than I should have? In the visits following that year, I read some news articles about mutilated hikers, missing campers, and farm animals turning up dead. The goat man was getting more aggressive. One time, the creature looked right into my soul with its black, empty eyes, and for the first time since my initial viewing of it, my body gave to the most feared dread I had ever felt. The more violent the news stories became, the more I felt that the goat was getting more aggressive. Grandma even ended up buying more curtains for the house, acquired a better lock for the door, and actually went to a shooting range to learn how to use a shotgun. It came to the point where I was trying to make peace with the creature by leaving pig food in the field for it to eat, but instead, it snatched one of the hogs from the pig pen and ran into the woods. On the last day of the visit, I woke up to the sound of ear-splitting banging on the front door. Grandma was gripping her new shotgun, and with my dad holding a baseball bat, they waited for the intruder to burst through the door. Yet the banging subsided after a few minutes, the chirping and croaking of insects and frogs replacing it within the hour. After that incident, we didn't visit the ranch for 5 years, and I was nearing the end of my high school by then. My parents actually encouraged Grandma to move out of the house in light of people in her town being discovered murdered in their own homes. But being the stubborn grandma she was, she decided to go against it. Besides, she thought she knew how fortified her farm was. A few weeks ago, we returned to that awful farm, finding barbed wire on the outskirts of the field. There were fewer animals now, and I swear some of the surviving pigs had faded scars on their bodies from scratches, stabs, and bites not even the most vicious bear could manage. I was more jittery than I ever been in my life, and it was all because I knew that goat man was scheming someone in the deep woods, sensing that I had arrived on its land. I spoke with Grandma, who showed me a newspaper talking about how the FBI was getting involved in the murder investigations here, and that the criminal would be behind bars soon. However, as Grandma told me, other farmers around town were speaking about how the FBI's true motive was to cover up the real culprit. When we were having dinner, I poked at my food, ignoring the discourse my family was having. Afterwards, I went to my room and made sure the door was shut before I hopped into bed and waited. After hours of anticipating, in the field beyond my window, the monster dragged the bloody body of a peaceful doe into view. The goat man ripped the deer's intestines out and bit into the insides with its evil-loving fangs, spilling blood onto the moonlit ground. It turned its head to face my direction, hurling a piece of deer at the window. I jerked as blood splattered against the pane like a sheet of rain, startling me to full awareness. Me rushing from my bed to get a closer look at the field, I saw the goat man had left behind the body of a deer. It was mocking me, and I was sure of it. I settled back into bed with the blood sliding down the window, wrapping myself in my blanket as if it was armor, and getting ready for whatever might happen next. I have no idea how, but I drifted asleep with a piece of the creature's latest meal stuck to my window. That was when I had the worst nightmare any human mind could produce. It was a once-in-a-lifetime dream of horror, where the creature had crept into my room and was slicing chunks of muscle from my limbs and carving blocks of flesh out of my torso with its claws, choking me with its horns. The pain was real, and I smelled the rotten stench of the creature's dirt-matted fur. It was as if my mind was nagging at me and screaming at the top of its lungs for me to wake up. So I did. Soaked in sweat, I sent my eyes flying open, gasping like I was on the edge of dying. As I scrambled to see any sign of the goatman's presence outside, I panicked upon seeing several inconsistencies with how the room was when I went to sleep. Now, the door was wide open, and something had smeared deer blood on the inside of the window, and that's when the tapping reached my ears. Not from the window, but from my bed frame. 2 furry hands slumped over the frame, claws dripping blood onto the sheets. I froze, the form getting to its feet and tilting its head as it examined me. Too weak to fight and too shocked to run, I waited to die. But to my surprise, instead of slashing my belly, the goatman spoke.
"You be not ripe,"
it said before crouching on all fours and scurrying and walking out of the house. When the police arrived, they found the lifeless body of Grandma, who had died of a heart attack. After that, the FBI showed up, erasing all evidence of forced entry and the strange deer blood being inside the house. With me sobbing and my parents crying, Dad decided to get us a hotel, and I actually rejoiced at the fact that our room was on the 3rd floor. I shed a few tears and had a good rest, the thought of what the creature had said sipping through my mind. That was 2 weeks ago, and until now, I believe I would never have to see that farm for the rest of my life. But as it turns out, my grandmother had left the farm to me. Not only that, she clearly stated in her will that I should also inherit her shotgun. I don't want to go back there, but because she died, I feel a weight of guilt dragging me down. My heart desires for me to follow her last wishes, and they involve going back to Maryland with her gun. But first, I'm gonna try to get a priest to bless the farm, or an old American native elder to perform a smudging ritual. Even though I'm skeptical about those ideas working, I don't know when I'll have an update. I just know it has to be soon, or else. This story was told to me by one of my good friends who has Navajo background on her father's side. It happened several years ago when she was spending the last 2 weeks of summer visiting relatives on a reservation in New Mexico, and is by far one of the creepiest things I ever heard. My friend Jessie was 12 at the time and playing outside with her cousins. They were tossing a frisbee around, and one of the younger kids threw it too hard. It flew over the fence and was swallowed up by a small grove of oak trees. Jessie, being the eldest, went to retrieve it, leaving her 11-year-old cousin Ellie in charge until she got back. The sun was setting, lighting up the sky in brilliant shades of orange as Jessie made her way over to the grove. After some poking around, she found the frisbee caught in one of the tree's branches. As she climbed, she began to sing an old Navajo song, but stopped singing when her body suddenly went cold. That's exactly how Jessie described it to me. Cold, as if she'd been dunked in ice water. You know that annoying scary story cliche of feeling like you're being watched? Well, It's only cliche because it's true. Jessie could feel a pair of eyes following her, even when she looked around her and saw nothing. Seriously creeped out, she grabbed the frisbee and ran back to her grandmother's house, just in time to see the old woman step into the porch and call for the kids to come inside. However, the true horror didn't start until several hours later. Jessie, her cousin Ellie, and Ellie's little sister Clara were asleep in their grandmother's guest room when Jessie woke up to the strangest sound she had ever heard. She described it to me as a cross between radio static and the noise an old movie reel makes. At first, it sounded distant, but after a minute or two, Jessie realized it was getting closer. Beside her, Ellie rolled over and said, "What is that?" "I don't know," Jessie whispered. They waited, holding their collective breath. By now, the sound was right outside the window, and that's when Jessie realized it was singing. At this point in her retelling of the story, Jessie went white and began glancing over her shoulder. She told me the song was the exact same one she had been singing in the tree grove earlier. It sounded so wrong, she said, rubbing her arms as if a cold breeze had rushed by her. Remember when we listened to that clip of the very first recording of a human voice? How weird it sounded? When I nodded, Jessie added, "It was like that, but a little clearer." Somehow, that made it even worse. Jessie and Ellie were both terrified, while Clara, unaware, slept on. Through the thin blue curtain over the window, they could see the dark shadow of something peering in at them. To this day, Jessie can't explain what motivated her to get up and see for herself, especially because she was scared shitless. Ignoring Ellie's protest, she slid out of bed and walked across the room on shaky legs. As soon as she drew back the curtain, she regretted her choice. Staring back at her was the most terrifying creature she had ever seen. It had the head of a deer, with antlers like dead tree branches, and eyes so black they seemed to absorb the faint silver moonlight. It had a scrawny humanoid body, with abnormally long arms and legs, and as Jessie stood there, caught in its hideous gaze, it raised a hand and scratched at the window with a horrible screeching sound that made Jessie's skin crawl. It was Ellie's scream that jolted Jessie out of her terrified state. She stumbled back from the window and landed on the carpet floor. Clara woke up and began screaming too. Then their grandmother ran in and turned on the light. The thing at the window had vanished, leaving behind 3 long scratches in the glass, and the whole family terrified. Jessie's grandmother was able to calm down the hysterical children enough so they could tell her what happened. As she listened, her face became pale. She hustled the girls downstairs to the living room and made up a bed for them on the couch. She then sat by them all night, and whenever one of them asked her what was going on, the old woman simply shook her head. Needless to say, Jessie and her cousin didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jessie's grandmother announced that everyone was to stay inside that day, no arguments. She looked so shaken that nobody dared to protest. Around noon, she called for a medicine woman to come and bless the house. Later, after the woman left, Jessie merged into the kitchen where her grandmother was loading the dishwasher. "Tell me what that thing was," she said bluntly. Her grandmother sighed and motioned for Jessie to sit down. "You have heard the legend of Skinwalkers?" "Yes." Jessie frowned and nodded, vaguely recalling the story. "So that was a skinwalker?" Her grandmother nodded. "Yes." "Grandma," said Jessie at a light dawn, "I think it overheard me singing in the tree grove yesterday." Her grandmother's dark eyes narrowed. "Why do you say that?" because it was singing that same song, you know, the song that you used to sing to me when I was little. Her grandmother was silent for a long time before whispering, "You're a very lucky person, but luck has its limits. From now on, you must be more careful." The look in the old woman's eyes as she spoke those words still haunts Jesse to this day. As I said earlier, that was years ago, 7 to be specific. Jesse has returned to the res many times actually, each without incident, but she has never set foot in that tree grove again, and most likely never will. Jesse's grandmother died this past March at the age of 87, and Jessie later moved in with her auntie for the summer so she could help clean up the old house, which the family was going to rent out. She had been there for about a week when I went down there to visit her. On my first night, we sat on the porch and drank some beers, and I found my eyes drifting towards the tree grove. "So that's where it all happened?" Jessie shuddered and nodded. "Yeah, tomorrow I'm taking you to the medicine woman and have her bless you." "Is that actually necessary?" The look Jessie gave me nearly turned me to stone. "You think nothing will happen to you because you're white, but when you're in Navajo land, you're in Skinwalker land. Take caution." I nodded. That night, I swore I heard radio static outside the house. When I brought it up to Jessie the next morning, she didn't speak, but grabbed my arm and practically dragged me to the medicine woman, where I was blessed. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip, and I went back to the city. I didn't post this here with the intention of teaching a moral, but I suppose if there is something to be learned from the story of the singing Skinwalker, it's that there are things out there we can't explain. The look in Jessie's eyes when she recounted her experience and told me everything I need to know, what she saw, truly horrified her. And all I can say is, I'm grateful I didn't have to go through it myself. I was the first to notice an extra person had joined our group. I counted 6 of us sitting around the campfire, but I knew we had left home with 5. The 6th person had joined us somewhere along the way, but where and when exactly, I could not be sure. All the glowing faces looked familiar, like I had known them all for a lifetime. That was why it took so long to find a man out of place. I had to go through the faces one by one. I went through my history with them, recounting how I met them, how I knew them. I fit each one into my memories like puzzle pieces. First, there was Mark. He was sitting next to Sarah, talking with her as always. I met Mark and Sarah 6 years ago in the 10th grade. Mark and I played wide receiver together on the school football team. Sarah was a cheerleader, and Mark always had a thing for her. The 3 of us started hanging out after games, Mark flirting non-stop, and Sarah always hilariously rebuking him after a while. Then there was Ben. We had been best friends since the 1st grade, ever since we bumped heads playing tag during recess. He had his arm around his longtime girlfriend, Justine. She started at our school when she moved from Chicago in the 7th grade. Ben sat next to her in class, and soon she became a part of our group at that time. She was quiet and shy when she first arrived, but once we got to know her, she opened up. She was one of the coolest and nicest people you could ever get to meet. She had also become close with Sarah in the past few years. And then, there was the 6th face. The piece that did not fit. I stared at him, and his name escaped me. That is, if I ever had it in my memory banks in the first place. He looked familiar, but I could not place him in my memories. But why, if I recognized him? Why could I not remember his name? Why did he sit among us, acting as if he belonged here? He stared at Mark and Sarah as they chatted. He started laughing when they would laugh, smile when they smiled. I couldn't figure it out. The question burned in my head. How had he, a stranger, joined our little group without any of us noticing something amiss? Hey, Porter. Ben pulled me from my thoughts. Your head up in the clouds or something? I was just telling Justine about our 5th grade teacher. What was his name again? Mr. Smith, I said. Oh yeah, Mr. Smith. I was telling Justine how you could rile that guy up like nobody else could. Remember that one time you gave your homework printed in yellow ink? Ben and Justine laughed. Yeah, I remember, I said. I can still see the steam coming out of his ears. They laughed again, and I semi-joined in. When I glanced the strange man's way, he was watching us, grinning, just watching, part of the reason he had flown under the radar. I was struck with the sense that he was studying us. My skin started to crawl. Ben drained his beer and threw the empty can in the cooler. Well, I gotta take a leak, he said and walked into the woods, swallowed up by the darkness. You really know how to push people's buttons when you want to, huh? Justine said. I shrugged. I was having trouble focusing on the conversation. The weight of the situation, the reality of it, was starting to hit me. A strange man had attached himself to our group unnoticed, and who the fuck knew what his motivations were? Questions raced through my mind, none I could answer. How had no one else noticed yet? Why had it taken me so long to notice? Was I going insane? Am I forgetting things and forgot this one friend of ours? The strange man then stood with jerkiness. I gotta take a leak, he said. It was the first time I heard him speak. He spoke in a strange way. It sounded as if he had to force the words from his throat. He walked with an awkward gait, and like Ben, disappeared behind the dark veil of the trees. No one else flinched. Justine kept talking. I always loved the long relationship you and Ben have. It was so hard moving cities and leaving all my old friends behind. I mean, I can't complain too much. I wouldn't have met Ben and all you guys otherwise. Justine, don't you see what's going on here? Huh? You're telling me you haven't noticed? Notice what, Porter? What are you talking about? Who was that guy? I gestured to the vacated spot the strange man left behind. Oh, him? He's, what's his name? She trailed off. She frowned into the fire. I could see her mind ticking over, and her eyes twinkle with concern. I knew I wasn't going crazy. I don't know, she said. Who is it? That's what I'm trying to figure out. We stared at each other. Maybe... Justine was cut off. An ear-piercing screech came from the woods. It sounded like a shrill, injured cat. A large cat. The sound split in the air and cut our conversations short. A blanket of silence fell over the 4 of us. Only the crackling campfire persisted. The woods were still and quiet. The fuck was that? Mark broke the silence. I don't know, Sarah said. I have never quite heard an animal like that before. Sounded like some fucked up mountain lion, Justine said. Have you ever heard anything like that before? I shook my head. My fingers tingled with adrenaline. Ben was still in the woods, and the strange man was out there with them. Dread filled my gut. There's no mountain lions out here, Mark said. Most likely an elk. They can make some creepy sounds. Sarah agreed. Justine bit her lip and scanned the woods. It's okay. I think Mark's right, I said to her, but I wasn't sure I believed it. Mark and Sarah had started up their conversation again. when the strange man came out of the woods. They paid him no mind. I was hoping something would have triggered in them by now, but they were oblivious. The strange man took a beer from the cooler. He fumbled with it, struggling with the tab. It was as if he had never opened the can before. When he finally got it open, he sat, beer in hand, and continued to watch Mark and Sarah, a thin smile on his face. He never did take a sip. I watched them from across the campfire, his head wavering behind the heat. I touched on what made me uneasy about this strange man, aside from the fact that he had managed to infiltrate our group without any of us noticing for a long time. He moved with jerkiness and awkwardness, like a newborn animal. Nothing he did was well practiced. It made everything he did look like an act, an imitation. I didn't make the connection at the time, but I should have seen this man was not quite human. But at the moment I wasn't sure what to think. I guess I just thought he was a freak. I considered calling him out, then and there. I wanted to ask him just what the fuck he was doing, but I'll admit, I was a little scared. I had visions of this guy being some horrific serial killer, and I didn't know how dangerous he was, or if he was armed. I didn't want to push him into doing something drastic that got all of us killed. As time went by without any sign of Ben, I became convinced the strange man had done something to him. I watched them plan and marking his next target. Anger sprouted from my fear, and I started to see red. I needed to stop him. We used an axe to chop firewood for our campfire, and it was leaning against my seat. This man was dangerous. I was sure of it. I convinced myself I needed to do something before another one of us was next. I clutched at the axe's handle. Justine touched my arm. "Porter, where's Ben? I'm getting nervous." "It's okay," I lied, patting her hand. "I'm sure everything is okay." I stood with the axe in hand. "I'm gonna go get some more firewood," I announced, more awkward than I hoped. Okay, dude," Mark said. "Porter?" Justine's voice. Speaking up was a mistake. I had drawn the attention of the strange man. I walked past him, trying to act as nonchalant as possible, but I was never a good actor. He watched me the whole way. He kept his glare on me as I reached the area of the woods, and as he looked back, his head rotated around an unnatural distance. That was enough to chill my spine. I was hoping he would turn around to look away and give me an opening, but he never did. I'm not exactly sure what happened next. I never saw him stand up and walk over to me. I never even saw him move a single muscle. But just like that, in an instant, he was standing in front of me, inches away from my face. It was as if he had teleported. A metallic smell stung my nose. The strange man stunk of blood and copper. The axe trembled in my hand. Any thought of actually using it fled my mind. I locked into place, my skin covered in goosebumps. Power radiated off of him. He spoke to me.
"Get some firewood,"
he said in his forced tone, and he smiled wide. At that moment, Ben emerged from the woods. "Ben," Justine cried. "Jesus," Ben said as Justine squeezed him. "Did you guys hear that cat thing?" "We think it was an elk," Mark said. "Where were you? Why did you take so long?" Justine asked. "I guess I wandered too far off, and I lost sight of the campfire. Took me a bit to find my way back. For a second I thought I was going to have to freeze my ass off out there alone tonight." The relief washed over my body like a wave, crashing into my muscles. I felt each one relax. At least Ben was safe. I looked for the strange man, but he was gone. He somehow slinked away while I was distracted. He was good at going undetected when he wanted to. My thoughts turned to getting out of there. Even though Ben was unharmed, that guy was still trouble. I started back towards the group and caught the middle of their conversation. "Yeah, who was that guy?" Ben said. "I thought he was with you guys," Sarah said. "Yeah, isn't he your friend?" Mark added. "I thought he drove over with you three." No," Ben said. "I don't know him." The panic spread over everyone's faces. They were finally feeling what I was feeling. The realization had set in. "We need to get out of here," I said, "before he comes back." "Yes, please," Justine said. "We have to leave now. That guy was a freak, right, Porter?" I explained to them how I noticed he was the odd man out when we were sitting around the campfire. I explained the odd behavior, and they all agreed the guy was strange and possibly dangerous. None of us could pinpoint exactly when he had joined the group. He had slipped unnoticed and unaccounted for. It was strange. We packed our tents in record time. We trekked the 15 minutes to our vehicles through dark woods, flashlights in hand. We heard the screech of the elk again, if it was an elk, which I had my doubts about now, and we took some comfort from the fact it sounded further away. Even so, we picked up our pace for the final stretch of the walk. I felt like I could finally relax behind the wheel and lock doors of my SUV. Justine and Ben sat in the back, while Mark and Sarah followed behind us in Mark's old beaten-up vehicle. We were heading out of the woodland and were planning to shack up in a motel for the night before heading home in the morning. I thought we were free and clear. We worked our way around the dark roads that snaked through woods. I let a smile open up my face when we finally reached the exit road. It was an arrow-straight stretch of asphalt that split through the last few miles of woodland. I pressed on the gas. I couldn't wait to get the hell out of the woods, and I think Mark was feeling the same way because he sat close on my rear bumper. I remember thinking, at least we'll have a strange tale to tell after all this. I didn't think it was about to turn into a horror story. The trees and the dashed lines on the road blurred past us. My headlights reached out for the endless road, and my meter needled its way towards 100 miles per hour. I don't know what possessed me to go that fast, and I wish Mark hadn't followed my lead. It was a mistake. The strange man appeared from behind a tree. He walked into the middle of my lane. I slammed the brakes, but it was too late. The next sequence of events happened so fast it placed like a slideshow in my mind. The tires screeched and there was a smell of burning rubber. The strange man folded over my vehicle and got sent flying down the road. He skated across the pavement on his back, moving with such speed it looked like he was gliding on ice. More tires screeching. Mark flew past in the opposite lane, fishtailing. He fought it, and for a moment I thought he had it saved, but the vehicle hooked right into the trees. The sickening sound of crunching metal sounded in the air. Mark's car slammed into a tree, driver's side first, sending fragments of glass and metal flying. The car bounded off one tree and into another. The front passenger side impacted this time. The front light exploded, and the passenger side cavity caved in, sending a wheel bounding into the woods. The crumpled heap of a car came to a rest. Justine was the first out the door, crying out Sarah's name. Ben went after her, and I followed after him. Everything felt surreal as shock coursed through my body. It was as if I was watching through a screen. I floated over the asphalt as Justine and Ben sprinted towards the streaming wreckage, the crash scene dimly lit by my SUV's one remaining headlight. There are two screams I'll never forget. They imprinted themselves on my brain, and I'm gonna hear their echoes at night forever. The first one I heard was when I was 13. It came from my mother. It flooded the house, splashing off the walls. I ran out of my room to see her crumple at the front door, with two police officers standing by. They had notified her that her eldest son, my brother, had died. The second came from Justine when she saw what was waiting for us in the vehicle. Mark was unrecognizable. He was a shattered mess of bone, skin, and blood, blended and intertwined with the crumpled steel. Sarah was blinking slowly, her breathing labored, her one arm shattered, broken in too many pieces to count. Her legs crushed at knees from the front of the vehicle, which crumpled back into her leg space. Her legs would have been flat if I could see them. Justine turned away and fell to her knees, with her face buried in her hands. Ben tried to comfort her, but he had to turn away and throw up on the side of the road. I pulled out my phone and struggled to dial 911. With my fingers shaking, I kept pressing the wrong numbers. My voice was small and distant as I explained what happened to the operator. She told me to stay on the line, but as I looked down the road, I dropped my phone. The strange man was standing there. His grin reached from ear to ear, showing a grandstand of his teeth. His shoulders shrugged up and down as if he was laughing. In fact, the fucker was laughing. If I were not in shock, I would have gone after him right there and then. I would have torn his heart, if he has one, right from its chest. But all I could do was stare, struggling to keep the tears behind my eyes. The strange man started for the woods. I watched them go, and I watched them change. I saw it. I know I did. This was no illusion, no trick of the mind. This was real. I saw him. Shapeshift. I saw. It's true. Form. We were not dealing with something human that night. After countless hours of research, I believe I saw what others have called the goat man. Its horns were sticking out, uneven from its head, with rows of sharp teeth, and walking upright, like a man, with an awkward gait. It vanished into the shrouded woods. It's been 8 months since that night. I only seen my friends a handful of times since then. Our relationships have shattered and are left in ruin. All we are now to each other is a stark reminder of that night. Mark is dead. Sarah survived, but as a triple amputee. Justine and Ben broke up. And here I am, rugged with a scraggly beard and hair that has been uncut, after spending every sleepless night researching this monster I saw that night, the goat man. I'm going back to those woods. I'm coming for the goat man, and I'm not stopping until one of us is dead. I wanted to share something that I experienced as a child. I'm somewhat a believer of the paranormal, but the analytical, rational side of me always begs to differ slightly. This story is also very true. My grandmother isn't one to play around, especially about something like this. I'm not sure if you all will believe me, but I do want to say that this absolutely scared the crap out of me, and still actually does. So I thought I would share. I apologize in advance if I don't format my story correctly, or isn't as eloquent as other stories. I was about 10 or 11 years old at the time of this story. My mom wasn't home. I can't remember exactly where she was, but it was just me and my grandma on this one night. It was around this age that I had discovered whistling, how to do it well, and I found myself doing it quite often. At nighttime though, my grandma didn't like me doing it and kept telling me not to whistle at night and how it wasn't good. Despite her countless warnings, I just couldn't stop. It was a bad habit that I found myself doing without even thinking. So I'm not sure if you guys know already, but apparently whistling at night is really bad. My grandmother said that when you whistle at night, it's basically an invitation for the spirits to come to your house, or something like that, around that definition. Now, my grandmother is a firm believer of the paranormal. She has experienced a lot of stuff, but being young, I obviously didn't know that. Just as a side note, she has this thing with mirrors at night and avoids them. It's really bad apparently. I'm pretty sure it stems from a deep cultural belief, one of which I have almost no knowledge of, as I was born in a different country, and so I'm not subjected to her cultural beliefs. After the whistling incident, and realizing my grandmother doesn't do certain things, for no reason, I developed a fear of mirrors, even though I didn't really know why. I know it's kinda stupid. I might ask her one day. Moving on, being the dickhead that I was at the time, I didn't listen, most likely due to the fact that I didn't really believe that such a thing was possible. This night was no different. I was whistling to my heart's desires. Everything was going as normal that night, and I slept in the room at the very back of our house. My grandmother was in the room just outside of mine. It was kind of like a sitting room. I'm not sure what Americans call it. The lounge, I guess. I was sleeping away until my grandmother shook me to wake up. I'm a very heavy sleeper, but when she began to wake me up, I got up right away, and that never happens. As soon as I woke up, I could see the fear and shock in her eyes. I will never forget the way she looked at me. She told me I couldn't sleep in that room, and instead made me sleep with her in one of the rooms at the front of the house. So the rooms from the front to the back were pretty far away. Initially, I was confused, like, why can't I sleep in that room? And why did she look so scared? She didn't tell me that night, but the next day, she asked me if I heard anything that night, and I said no. She then told me that while she was in the other room, she heard someone standing right outside my window, whistling. I always wondered what would have happened if my grandmother wasn't there, or if she didn't hear it. Even though I wasn't a witness to this, I truly do believe her. And ever since that day, I don't ever whistle at night again. By the way, I did some research on the mirrors. I found out that if you sleep in a room that has a mirror in it, and that you can see it from where you sleep, and an open window, you're basically calling your dead ancestors to come knocking. So let this be a warning. If you're in bed tonight, in your own room, and you can see a mirror from where you're at, I would recommend you get rid of it. That is, if it's not too late. Hi everyone. This story comes from one of my friends who used to be a ranger at the national park I work at, and not from my personal experience. I asked him to tell me his scariest experience at the job, and it just so happened to be his last. I'll tell it from the first person view. My normal shifts were during the day, 9 to 5 like most people. But on that day, we were shorthanded on the night shift, because the last person who worked during those hours had just quit. Lately, we had a whole lot of people quitting the night shift, so that meant that I had to cover. Strange enough, I never had to work the graveyard shift before then, and I was actually excited for it. I had brought some coffee and 5-hour energy shots with me because the hours ran 10 to 5, and there was no way I would make it that far naturally. I got to my tower right before 10 o'clock, when it was already pitch black. and the cold July night had fully set in. The tower was very tall, with several flights of stairs leading up to the top. The whole thing was mostly surrounded by thick forest, except for the trail I came in from, and a murky pond that was just to the right of one of the tower legs. I climbed up, and all I could hear was the non-stop sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. When I hit the top, I fumbled with my keys until I finally found the right one and walked right on in. The one room was small and square-shaped. 3 of the walls were mostly glass, and the other one wasn't, and had the door I just came in. The roof went up like a pyramid for some short feet until it peaked, and it was all made of wood. To my left was a nicely made bed, and a nightstand with a lamp and a flashlight on top. It's not like I'm gonna be using the bed though. On the wall next to that was my CB radio and communication stand, which every one of these towers had. Next to that sat my fridge and microwave, which was part of a small kitchen that extended to the other wall as well. Inside the kitchen on the right wall were several cabinets, some small ones that held snacks and some canned foods, and another set of giant cabinets that I couldn't open, which most likely had vacuums and other cleaning supplies that weren't above my pay grade. I went over to the communication stand and did my standard check to make sure everything was working. I called into the ranger station's channel and said, "Hey Donnie, it looks like it's just you and me tonight." Donnie didn't say anything back, so I figured he was just taking a shit. I went and grabbed a flashlight on the stand and reached into one of its drawers, pulling out a set of binoculars from it. I went back out to the balcony and checked to make sure no fire hazards or any other kind of dangerous things were over there. Once I checked that box off my to-do list, I headed back inside and pulled out the chair from the communication stand and put it by one of the glass walls and grabbed a granola bar from one of the kitchen cabinets to munch on. I raised the binoculars up to my eyes and looked over to the surrounding forest. It didn't seem like any animals were up and about, and no birds were in the sky. I skimmed over a couple of clearings to make sure that no teenagers were off camping illegally. Then I went and peeked over at a far ridge, where I saw a snowman standing alone in the gap of the trees. Hold the fuck up. It was July. I looked again to see it wasn't a snowman, but some kid in a shitty ghost costume. It looked like the ones from Charlie Brown, with the big black holes for eyes that looked more like they were colored black than actual holes. The kid was still and staring right into where I was at, unmoving. I couldn't see the kid's parents anywhere, and by now it was rolling up to be 11 o'clock, so that meant something was up. I broke contact on the kid and walked to the radio, calling into the station. "Hey Donnie, are you done taking a shit yet?" I barely made it out, but I'm here now. I chuckle. Donnie was always good for a laugh. There's some kid with a blanket walking around the southeast sector, and they look alone. A blanket? What the hell are you even talking about? It's a ghost costume. It's got the black holes for eyes and stuff. You mean like the Charlie Brown costume? Can you check it out? Yeah, I'll go and see what's up. I'll call in on the walkie-talkie to tell you what I see. Roger that. I turned off the radio and crossed over to the nightstand drawer to grab the walkie-talkie. Once I had it, I sat back down in the chair and put the binoculars up to my eyes, zooming in to where the kid was. The ridge was empty, with no kid in sight, which I knew would make this 1,000 times harder. I pulled up the antenna on the walkie-talkie and dialed to the right channel. Donnie, you hear me? Yep, loud and clear. I'm getting close to the sector. I'm heading up to a ridge for a better view. Perfect. That's where I saw the kid, but they moved on since then. Well, I'm just gonna check around to see if I can find anything. I watched as Donnie came over to the ridge, waving his flashlight around the dark, until he looked towards the tower and shrugged. Nothing over here. Damn. Hopefully he turns up again. Until then, I'll just notify the police and check with any missing reports. Alright, I'm gonna go back to where Donnie's voice cut out, and I saw his flashlight turn off in the distance. The spot where he was at was swallowed in by darkness. Donnie, are you there? I heard no response, and I quickly rushed outside the door and around the corner to where I saw him, yelling his name, only to hear my voice echo in the woods. And that's when it hit me. There wasn't a single other sound in the whole forest. The crickets and frogs had stopped chirping. The wind didn't rustle through the leaves. Everything was completely standstill. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, and nothing else. I moved my flashlight around the woods, attempting to find them. I got into that state of mind where I got so scared my throat closed up, and if I moved, I felt like something very bad was gonna happen. I had to do something. I turned around, and as I did, I glanced at the stairs below me. At the bottom of the stairs stood a skinny, horrible, angled woman. She was tall, dripping with water, with black hair and dark, murky blue skin that was stretching across her bent and broken bones. Her gray dress was shredded, and her black shoes were muddy and wet. And her face, her eyes were milky white, and her mouth hung wide open like a snake, like her jaw had been broken. She let out a blood-curdling and ear-piercing scream of agony, and began to shuffle up the stairs so fucking fast that I snapped out of my fear lock and I ran the fuck back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. There was no way she could run that fast, even if all of her bones weren't broken in wrong directions. I ran back to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and then I pulled out the walkie-talkie, screaming into it. Is anyone there? Donnie, where the fuck are you, man? Someone, answer me. Then I heard the cracking of a door. I slowly turned, and I froze when I saw what was there. The door was still there, locked and shut, and had been completely undisturbed. What scared me was the giant cabinet that was supposed to be locked now stood open, with a kid dressed like a Charlie Brown ghost standing just in front of it. I stood there, not moving until I heard the little shit giggle. I recognized that giggle. No fucking way. I pulled off the sheet to see one of Donnie's kids, Marvin, sporting a smirk and a walkie-talkie. Dad, I got him. I bet he pissed his pants just like I said he would, right? He and his other son laughed from the other end of the walkie. I was mad, but also glad that I wasn't about to get murdered in a wooden tower. I grabbed this walkie and shot back. Pissed me off is what you did, you fucking asshole. I hope you're happy. Hearing you scream like a little girl sure did make me happy, alright. Yeah, screw you too. That wasn't even me. That was your stupid zombie chick. Who even was that? Your wife? My what? Does the ghost look like a zombie from that far away? You said yourself it looked like Charlie. Not the ghost, dumbass. The woman on the stairs. She screamed and ran up them so that she could scare me into the tower. Hell, she must be like an Olympic runner. Who was that? Dean. I'm not exactly sure who you're talking about. I didn't put no woman on the stairs. After hearing that he would have the night shift for the next couple of weeks until they found a replacement, my friend quit and vowed to never go back to the park. To this day, he swears that either Donnie never told him about that part being a prank, or that he saw something unrelated. I began to question my own participation in the night shifts, and consider myself lucky that the few times I've been on it, I had been stationed at the north and east sectors. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was around 1,000 acres down outside of that area and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad figured that he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did this help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father and son time. I remember the drive down from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep. That car was so uncomfy. I absolutely hated it. The only thing I could do was stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket. Something I was never able to accomplish when I was younger. The drive obviously took most of the day. So we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he didn't have anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin and the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it out. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit, something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling that somebody was watching us. I was finally able to drift off for what I guess was an hour maybe. When we woke up, it was around 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer, and it was very hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for about an hour, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical form of ground where they had been, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. However, some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention, the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright color red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunting out here. This is private land." The person didn't move at all. Dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us, with his hands in his pockets. The weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now, this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down. I watched them circle around to the form of the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the form of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring at it, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of it being outside for more than one day, at the most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, like somebody was watching us, and I knew my dad was feeling it as well. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but it was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and left. We drove back home that day, and we didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young, and the least possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week, he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone. No mannequin or anything. This experience still makes my hair stand on end. I have no idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. This isn't the creepiest thing that's happened to me in the woods, but it's definitely in my top 3. As many of you might already know, many Navajo people, including my own family, are very reluctant to speak about skinwalkers because it is believed to attract their attention. However, I grew up away from the Navajo Nation and was very naive about the subject. When it came to skinwalkers, I was an absolute skeptic. My mom used to tell a story of how back in the 80s when she lived with her siblings and my grandparents, who are still in Shiprock, about how she and my aunt saw a skinwalker just outside her driveway under a streetlight. She described it as a black dog with dirty fur, a twisted noodle-like front leg, and these unnatural eyes with a soft burnt orange glow. Me, being my own close-minded self, doubted every word. But I never said my doubts out loud. But these doubts totally changed last year when I went to my grandparents' house last October. Me and my family had just finished coming from the carnival at the Navajo Nation Fair. The house was close enough where we could walk home in just 10 minutes. So we did. When we got there, it was around 9 p.m. and we stayed up until 2 a.m. catching up about family affairs and the local news. It was at that time that I decided to open my mouth and ask the question, "Are skinwalkers real, y'all?" I asked. "You shouldn't be speaking about that," my grandma said with a disturbed tone. So she and my grandfather both decided to go to bed. After being scolded by my mom, one of my aunts chimes in with a very cautious tone and says, "Oh, they're real. I had a few start screaming outside my trailer in Farmington just a few nights ago, and your cousin had nightmares the whole night and woke up crying that morning." Not wanting to push the discomfort any further, we all decided to go to bed. Now the trailer home is pretty old, and it was a really nice night, so we slept with the windows open with screens to prevent bugs coming in. Everyone had drifted off to sleep, except me. Why? Because my mind was still going on a million miles about skinwalkers, and I wonder if I ever encountered one while here on the reservation. As a kid, I was told it's taboo to think about skinwalkers because it can still call their attention. And that's when shit totally hit the fan. Just as I was finally getting relaxed for sleep, I started to hear something moving outside. I get up from the couch and start walking towards the kitchen window. In the trailer, all the rooms have the lights out, so the only visible light that can be seen is from the porch light out front. I was thankful for this because I told myself that if it was really a skinwalker outside, then hopefully it wouldn't notice me seeing it. So I muster up the courage and take a quick scan of outside. From the porch light, All I can see is the dusty ground and the vehicles that my family drove along with some old metal trash cans that stood beside the road. Looking for about a good 5 seconds, I wasn't able to see anything, so I was getting ready to turn around and walk back to bed, thinking it was just a stray cat or something. I must have only taken about 2 steps when I hear what sounded like a distorted scream coming from outside, definitely close by. With fear rising, I look outside again and there I see it. A coyote-like figure was staring at my direction from behind the cars, just outside of the reach of the porch light. Only it looked wrong and gave off an evil vibe just from seeing it. It was gray with a horrific orange-red soft glow that came from its eyes. I ran back to the bedroom. It was at this moment that I began to notice an awful stench in the air that smelled like rotten meat. I started trying to wake up my mom, who was like, "It's almost 3 a.m. What do you want?" I immediately began in a shaken voice, "There's something scary outside." Then she said, now annoyed because I woke her up, "It's most likely a stray animal or something. It's the res. Animals wander all the time at night." She obviously wasn't getting the drift of what I was saying, so I screamed, "There's some Blair Witch Project shit going on outside, Mom." That got her attention. "What the hell are you talking about?" she said. Then we heard it. The thing outside started making more of its dreadful like screams and started what sounded like trashing outside on the ground. "You hear that? That's what I'm talking about." So both her and I got back up, looked outside the window, and the coyote thing was making its way to the door. It was walking with an odd limp and dragged its back right leg. We could hear it start to scratch against the door. My mom went and got my dad, and they both started shouting in Navajo, all sorts of words telling the thing to go away and saying it's not welcome here. All this commotion was enough to get the rest of the trailer up as they came out into the hallway. The only thing my mom did was turn to them and said, "Skinwalker," while proceeding to point to the door. Apparently, they already knew exactly what to do, as my grandfather got out a handgun from a drawer and a bag of ashes. He coated a few bullets and loaded them into the gun and went straight to the door, yelling out more Navajo that was too fast for me to comprehend. He swung open the door and fired twice. Nothing. The thing was able to escape. "That's the fastest one I ever seen," said my grandpa. "Next thing you know, the rest of my family and my parents are freaking out about what just happened, saying stuff like, 'What if it comes back tomorrow?' And 'It saw all of us. Does that mean we're targets now?'" Afterwards, my grandparents calmed everyone down, myself included, saying that we'll all be fine. The morning comes, and my grandparents call one of their neighbors and explain to them what happened. Apparently one of them is a medicine man who used to partake in Navajo ceremonies used for healing and curing sickness. And so he came over to bless each family member and also the grounds outside.